Hi, I'm Heidi Skinner with Heidi Skinner & Associates at Keller Williams. I'd like to introduce you to Mark Sampson, our listing specialist.
Hello, it's Mark Sampson again with Keller Williams St. George Realty. I'm excited about sharing with you some important information and techniques on how to get your home sold. Today's topic is the second in a sub-series of videos about the contract. Today I'll be talking about the importance of deadline dates within the contract. After discussing earnest money in the last video, this is the next logical step in understanding the contract. Deadline dates and earnest money are tied together. Deadline dates exist within the contract primarily to set a date for when the earnest money is in jeopardy, or in other words, non-refundable. There's 4 basic deadline dates within the contract. These are, number 1, a seller's disclosure deadline, 2, a due diligence deadline, 3, financing and appraisal deadline, and 4, settlement deadline. So, back to number 1, when the seller's disclosures deadline, what does this mean? This is a deadline date specific to the seller or homeowner, and this is the date by which the seller must provide to the buyer the disclosures. Disclosures are a 5-page document called seller's disclosures that a seller fills out, signs, and delivers to the buyer, making known to the buyer any issues that the property may have or may have had. A homeowner may also want to include, as part of the seller's disclosures package, a title report, a copy of the CC&Rs or the covenants, codes, and restrictions of the subdivision that may exist, and a copy of any rental or lease agreements that may exist on the property, of course, only if the property has a renter or leasee. Now, is it a law that the seller must provide these? No, it is not. However, if you are not providing this, it's a good idea to include in the contract what's called an as-is addendum. And this tells the buyer that they're buying it as is, at their own risk. Otherwise, you may be liable down the road for any issues with the property that you did not disclose. Okay, next, what is a due diligence deadline? This is a deadline date that is specific to the buyer. This is a date by which the buyer must complete all their inspections or surveys for the property. Many buyers will pay a professional home inspector to go through the home and report any issues or problems that they may see. And based on this report, the buyer may cancel or renegotiate the contract as long as it's on or before the deadline date. If the buyer tries to cancel the contract because of the inspection after the due diligence deadline date, then their earnest money is waived and non-refundable. Okay, next, what is the financing and appraisal deadline? This is a deadline date that is also specific to just the buyer. As you may have guessed, this is the date by which the buyer must have their loan approval and appraisal complete. If the buyer receives a loan denial from their lender, then they will need to provide a letter to the seller before this date. Otherwise, again, their earnest money is in jeopardy. Also, if the buyer's appraisal comes in below the agreed upon purchase price, then the seller must be notified of this before this date as well. Otherwise, again, the earnest money is in jeopardy. And lastly, what is the settlement deadline date? This is a deadline specific to both buyer and seller. This is a date by which both parties must settle the transaction. Typically, this occurs at a title company. Sellers will sign documents relevant to them, basically signing the deed over to the new buyer. The buyer will sign similar documents relevant to them, and also a stack of loan documents, as you may have experienced when you buy your home. If they're, of course, that's only if they're obtaining a loan to purchase the home. Obviously, if the buyer doesn't do this by the settlement deadline date, their earnest money is in jeopardy. And if the seller doesn't, then they would be liable as well for a lawsuit. In the end, negotiating these items well takes experience. Protecting your market time and winning earnest money disputes is what an agent like myself does best. I would of course recommend listing your home with an agent to protect yourself from these potential problems and pitfalls. It's important to really think through these deadline dates when you're doing a contract with a calendar in hand, trying to avoid filling out these dates casually or putting the same date in all 4 slots. Believe it or not, I've actually seen that. This would likely cost you lost market time, or even worse, course, lots of money. Well, that's all for today. I hope you learned something new today about contracts. In the next video, we'll be discussing the negotiation process of the contracts. And of course, if you know anybody that might be considering selling their home, or you think they may benefit from these videos, please feel free to forward it to them. And if you have any questions on this topic of deadline dates, feel free to contact me. My mobile is 435-862-6035, and my email address is marksampson@skinnerteam.biz. Thanks for viewing this. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.